Hi, we continue today in 1 Samuel 18 as the second of three occurrences of an evil spirit from God lands upon Saul. And you can see just as we start on the right side of the screen, I have the three examples of this laid out in columns, as you can see. The first one back in chapter 16, just before Saul met David. And we see there it's described as the spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from Yahweh tormented him. Notice in our current one, it says from God, which is in Hebrew Elohim. Would that have been understood as a different God by the author? It's not clear that we see a pattern of Yahweh versus Elohim in the books of Samuel or in the Deuteronomistic history as such. If you are familiar with the four source theory from the study of the Pentateuch, especially Genesis and Exodus, etc., we'd see that that might be a signal of a different source, that a Yahwistic source versus an Elohistic source. But that's not the case when we're dealing with the Deuteronomistic history. There certainly are, as most scholars would say, multiple threads within the Saul-David monarchy story, but not from different time periods from most scholars' point of view, or from different cultural contexts, simply different strands of the tradition that for whatever reason are woven here together. We don't need to treat this as three different versions in the sense of three different authors have placed a version of the single event here. We can certainly read it in the narrative context we've been doing to see this happens three times to Saul. There's nothing compelling us to see this as duplicates from different authors rather than duplicates from the same author that expects us to see all three. So from that perspective, we see it happens repeatedly, unless we see this is from a different God, and there's no basis for seeing that. In the third one that we'll see in the next chapter, it's again from Yahweh. So it in a way forms a little ABA chiasm, a spirit from Yahweh, a spirit from Elohim, and a spirit from Yahweh, but I'm not sure that's intended. And each one also, there's an element of David here anticipating someone skillful to playing the lyre. And of course, by our current passage, David was playing the lyre, although we'll look more closely and see this is not exactly what the translation is here, or here. Where here it says David was playing music, and here it's parallel with the hand, the spear in his hand, and David is playing with his hand. And we'll look more as we did last time at how the New RSV translation seemed to cover over the Hebrew's frequent use of body parts, in this case, hand, face, and eyes, as we'll see. And in the current one and in the one in chapter 19, in a slightly different red to highlight the difference, there's this double theme of Saul trying to pin David against the wall with his spear. And so here it suggests it happens twice, although only one is narrated, and then here it'll happen again. So repetition here, and when we look at chapter 19, we'll see perhaps what the reason for it is. Here it's not repetition, it's continuity, but drawing back our attention to the fact that from before the time that David arrived, Saul was troubled with his evil spirit, and David was the solution. But as you can see, even just from these couple of verses, and we'll look at it more closely in a minute, Saul is now throwing away his solution by trying to kill David one way or another. And so that will leave Saul vulnerable to this evil spirit with no apparent solution. So looking at our passage in terms of the key words we've been looking at, our passage for this video is simply this section right here. And you can see the elements that I've put in there to help reveal what the translation covers over. So here, as he raved within his house, David is playing with his hand, whereas here in the RSV it says playing the lyre. And then we see further when it says that David escaped, it says David turned from foot to face, which is a figure of speech to highlight that he ran away, but highlighting the face part. As is evident the very next phrase, David or Saul was afraid of David's face, as opposed to just simply afraid here, and we'll look at that more closely. Saul removed him from his face, which makes sense. It's no longer going to see him face to face. And then down here we see the face theme some more, where the New RSV has he had great success. We'll have to scroll down to see that here. And he stood in awe of him, but in the literal, he was a stranger to his face. And all Israel and Judah loved David, for it was he who marched out and came in leading before his face, as opposed to simply leading them. So I just want to highlight the important face theme, that this is a question of being face-to-face or not being face-to-face, as well as the question of what's on somebody's face in terms of how you can read them. As we'll see later in the story, David's face is a cipher. Whether we can read his face to tell us who he loves or who he doesn't love or what his intentions are is unclear, and yet the Hebrew text emphasizes that element of it. So going back up to our initial scene, we also will note that throughout 18 and 19, in addition to these keywords, there's a pattern of interlocking themes. So I've presented this here as, let's go back to the top, as three interlocking themes. The green represents Saul's children for or with David. So Jonathan here, Merab here, Mishal here, and then Jonathan again here and Mishal again here. And as many scholars have pointed out, the Jonathan Mishal elements form a little chiasm, an AB, CBA, or ABA if you want chiasm. The blue parts are David's success and or actions, and we'll note that the Hebrew word that we'll look at for success is repeated as a refrain here. So he went out and was successful there. He had success, and when Saul saw that he had great success, and then down here, David had more success than all the servants of Saul. The only other interaction in these chapters is not one specifically quoting a word for success, but it plainly is success. David went out to fight the Philistines and launched a heavy attack, and they fled. So that's plainly success. And then finally here, David fled. There's no success here except for the fact that he safely and successfully fled from Saul and arrived safely with Samuel. And then there's the red parts, which show Saul's steady deterioration here. So he starts off angry, as we saw last time, over the people in the streets, the women in particular, attributing to David tens of thousands and only thousands to Saul. Although, as we saw last time, it's probably a misreading by Saul of what the implication of that double phrase is. And then we see the section we're going to look at here, and then we'll see it some more. He's afraid of Saul, so he's afraid of the very person who is supposed to be his soother, and he becomes the enemy. David becomes the enemy of Saul as opposed to the Philistines being the enemy. And then we'll see it again with the third time of the evil spirit, and then we'll see it here where it plays out in a prophetic frenzy. And when we get there at the end of chapter 9, it'll draw us back to chapter 10 and the question of prophetic speech, which doesn't take place after this, and using the word for prophetic speech. So with those overviews, let's look a little more closely at the details of our passage. So the next day, and as my note highlights here, that we're slowing it down substantially. From the big view of David leading wars and summaries of that, we're going into a much slower pace here. So as you saw, an evil spirit from God, or as Fackelman suggests, can be of God. And if you're disturbed by the idea of an evil spirit, I suggest you go back and watch the video on chapter 16 on the verses I just noted, so where I talk about it in more detail of what that might imply. And the spirit rushed upon Saul. As it did in chapter 6. It's the usual word for what the spirit good or evil does, as the Spirit of God rushed upon David earlier. So it's a sense of wind, as the word spirit, ruach, means in Hebrew, both wind and spirit. So this blowing air, this breath from God, if you will, comes upon Saul, and he braved, or he prophesied, depending upon how you want to hear that. It's not emphasized here. It'll be emphasized in the scene in chapter 19 that I was referring to in the triple parallels, and we'll get to there when we get to it. He raved within his house. Notice it's here, it's not out in the streets, it's in the privacy of his house. And as Fackelman notes below, the privacy of the room contrasts with movement in the open field and the homecoming that we just saw, and accentuates the struggle with his explosive internal world. We could also read that as a play on words on house, because as we've already looked at and we'll see more, house is a triple entendre in the monarchy story: the physical building, the dynasty of a particular king, and the monarchy itself. So is he raving within his dynastic reality, or is this within his family? And because his family is going to have a very important part, as we saw, with Jonathan, Merab, and Mishal all having roles. So we don't know if it's referring just to the physical building, or also to the question of he's acting in this way in relation to his family and in relation to his dynasty, or his potential dynasty. While David was playing the lyre, and again, literally, he was playing with his hand, as he did day by day, highlighting the next day parallel, Saul had his spear in his hand. And that reminds us back to 13:22, and we heard told that the Philistines controlled sharpening, so only Saul and his son Jonathan had spears of all the Israelites. And he's not using it against the Philistines, he's using it against his would-be musical soother, David, or is about to be. And he throws it before we hear the thought. Notice, and this follows in Hebrew as well, the action precedes our hearing what his intention is. The word for thought is misleading because it's simply as he said, and the New RSV is implying he's saying to himself because there's no one apparently there alone in his house. But doesn't necessarily attribute to the narrator being able to get inside Saul's head. So he threw the spear here, and we'll see that again in chapter 20. And he thought, I will pin David to the wall, or literally, I will strike through David and into the wall, as Bodner translates here. So attaching David to the wall. And again, we'll see that again in chapter 19. But here we hear David eluded him twice, and this is where the phrase I noted earlier, right here, he turned from face to foot. I have foot to face here. This is face to foot, and I think this is right. Yes, it is right. So this is wrong here. I'll correct that on the forum before I. So you'll have the correct one on the web page. Although the figure of speech means twice, and hence the twice here. So from face to foot implies twice. And I've already noted the face theme here. And so here we hear that Saul was afraid of David. And what basis does he have to be afraid of him? It should be the other way around, as my note below suggests. Saul is the one with murderous intention on David, and already throwing the spear once, although we didn't know that David is here other than that he's playing the liar. So I said earlier that he was alone, and plainly he's not alone. David is right there with him. So this saying out loud would imply that David is hearing that, which leads him to run away. And so now Saul is afraid of David, plainly not because David is a physical threat to him, but he's a threat to his authority. He's already delegated to David the power that the people wanted a king for, which is to lead the army. And in a moment, we'll see how that frames a little chiasm within our section. So literally, he's afraid of David's face. And is that just a figure of speech, or is it the gaze that's part of this? He's afraid to see David eye to eye or face to face. So perhaps he's not just afraid of the abstraction of David as a whole, but literally David looking at him. Who knows what Saul sees when his eyes meet David? And the narrator here attributes it to because Yahweh was with him, but had departed from Saul. Presumably that's attributing knowledge to Saul. That the because clause suggests that the fear is because Saul knows that Yahweh was with David, but had departed from Saul. So now Saul knows what we know, and the phrase for depart here, turn aside, will be paralleled here, not paralyzed, paralleled here. So as the spirit of Yahweh has turned away from Saul, Saul will turn away from the presence of David, as we see here. Literally, he turns away from him. And made him a commander of 1,000, which back in 1 Samuel 8 was exactly what Samuel, using the words from Yahweh that he got in their one-on-one conversation, was what kings would do. Take your sons and turn them into commanders of 1,000. So here for alert readers is the literal fulfillment of what Samuel had been told by Yahweh to warn the people against, that your sons will become his commanders. And that's what's happening here. And then we see a little chiasm. So let me scroll down here so you can see the section. This phrase, David marched out and came in leading the army, and we'll look more at that in a minute, forms a little chiasm, as you can see here, framing it with 16b, and that Yahweh is with him in the narrator's voice here, not just in Saul's perception, and framing with David's success. So at the very center of this is David's success with everybody. He marched out and came in, as I've noted earlier in a couple of videos, army is always misleading here. This is not a situation where there's a nation with institution or a draft or any kind of formal organization for an army. This is just the people, and literally that's what it says in the Hebrew, facing the people. And so as Saul is afraid to face David, David is not afraid to face the people, and the people are not afraid to face him. And maybe looking upon David is what gives people the confidence and the success that's described here. We saw it earlier in 18:5. You can see that up here. And then we're seeing it here as a refrain throughout this section. And the narrator expands it here, not just in the army, but in all his way. So everything about David is successful, and the reason is that Yahweh was with him. So notice that the pairing here, Saul is afraid of David because he perceives that Yahweh was not with him, but David is successful because Yahweh is with him. Some scholars have taken this as a theological element as opposed to a political element, and there's been much criticism of that, and I think rightly so, because this is not a matter of theology. This is a matter of what forces are at work in between these folks in order for Israel to be right with Yahweh. But what's at issue is who they're turning to. So it's not a theological question, it's a very practical question. And as we've been seeing all along, the personal and the political and the theological, if you will, if that category is even relevant here, are always intertwined, as we see from the role of Saul's children, two of whom he uses as daughters to try to get David killed. So we'll see, as we've been seeing all along, the personal and the political are deeply interwoven. So when Saul saw that he had great success, and this is just a bad translation, or he stood in awe of him, as my note below says, most translations have some form of fear or dread, or at least fearful awe, because it's not standing in awe like you might of a sunset or something wonderful. It's definitely afraid. Literally, the phrase is he was a stranger to his face, or as some more suggest, or dreaded, and some translations have that. But I want to highlight the stranger to his face, as we see here, to highlight all the elements of David and Saul's facial relationship that's at issue here. So just to summarize that again, he's afraid of his face, and he takes him away from his face, and now he's completely a stranger to his face. But to the people, he's leading before their face. And that's what we see in the second half of the chiasm here. When all Israel and Judah loved David, it was he who marched out and came in, leading, literally went before their face. I will note also, Israel and Judah love David is, whether we think of it as anachronistic here or anticipatory is not clear. There is no Judah that David rules over until 2 Samuel 5, when he takes Jerusalem and then has an area of Judah with a capital that he can rule from. But the authors here are putting Israel and Judah as a paired set here. Notice not as one nation, as two different groups of people, but they're united around David because he's the one who's leading them in battle, and it's not Saul. So next time we'll continue as Saul in his desperation begins to offer his daughters as bait that will get David killed, and the first one will not happen for mysterious reasons that we'll look at next time. See you then.